So really what I'm hoping to do today is talk about the state of the climate innovation economy. This year has shattered records. There's a lot of talk about the world and the planet heating up faster than ever. We've had record heat waves in the US and Canada, wildfires all over North America, really tragic, human tragedy in Maui last week because of a wildfire. Sea temperatures everywhere are rising. And I think it's pretty obvious that the planet is struggling. The question is climate tech heating up or cooling off? We live in a time of change, and there's been a lot of uncertainty about the macro environment the last couple of years. So I really want to talk about lessons I've learned and what we're hearing and seeing as entrepreneurs and innovators in the climate ecosystem. A little bit on myself. I run a climate tech startup called Therma. We're a 70-person team based in the Bay Area. We've raised about 35 million of capital from venture capitalists and institutional investors, as well as angel and seed funds. We build technology to help reduce emissions and inefficiency around cooling, air conditioning, and refrigeration, which are two of the biggest sources of warming, ironically. Prior to becoming an entrepreneur, I worked in the White House for the Obama administration doing economic policy. And prior to that, I worked as an investor at one of the world's leading funds, D.E. Shaw, based out of New York. I went to Harvard for college and law school, did a master's at Cambridge, and have spent time thinking about policy innovation, both in government and on the private side. Excited to chat, and please connect with me online if you want to learn more or if you want to talk further. I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, Manik, Suri. Really excited to be here. The talk today, as I was saying, is really about the state of climate tech and climate innovation. The world is clearly heating up. The question is, what's happening with climate tech? Is it heating up or is it cooling off? My background as the founder and CEO of Therma is really as an entrepreneur, but prior to that, I worked in policy and in government, as well as in private equity. So I've had a couple of different roles in the last 20 years. I was saying that Therma focuses on cooling and cooling intelligence, and we try and reduce emissions, and we try and reduce inefficiency around refrigeration and air conditioning. We do that with a combination of sensors, software, and data science, a 70-person team based in the Bay Area, but with the customers around the world. And I'm excited to talk about the work offline. If anyone wants to learn more about Therma, check us out, hellotherma.com. Reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. The talk today is really about the state of climate tech, so I think it's important to put that in context. The climate crisis has two dimensions. There's a math dimension and a marketing dimension. The math dimension is really straightforward. We're just warming the planet up too fast. There's too much emissions happening. The greenhouse gas contribution is too high, and the planet can't metabolize that. We're not able to absorb those greenhouse gases on a planetary basis. And as a result, temperatures are rising. There are a lot of different possibilities to eliminate greenhouse gases, many different interventions. Some have to do with transforming energy. Some have to do with reducing the way in which we make emissions at a personal level, how we dine, how we date, how we engage in food production, the kinds of lives we live. Lots has been written about these different pathways. But I think the question for us as change makers is, what can we do to actually build the future? How are we going to actually innovate on the ground level? And so the clean tech 1.0 era is important because it informs what's going on with climate tech today. With clean tech, this was an era of innovation in the 2000s. I was just starting my career at this time. I just graduated from Harvard College, was working at D.E. Shaw doing private equity at one of the world's biggest hedge funds. Well, Clean Tech 1.0 was really an attempt to change the sources of energy generation. Most of the innovation was around the sun and wind, using solar and wind power as cleaner and more sustainable sources of energy rather than burning up fossil fuels, which are basically dead dinosaurs, coming out of the earth. So instead of burning up coal, we could diesel and natural gas, we could potentially use the sun and the wind. This era was led by a number of VCs, folks like John Doerr, and of course, early policymakers and public leaders in the political world. In the US, folks like presidential candidate Al Gore. When I was finishing college, there was a movie that came out called An Inconvenient Truth. I saw it my last year of school. And at the time, I couldn't believe that climate change was going to happen in our life. I thought it was going to be something our kids or our grandkids had to deal with. Well, the clean tech era fueled a lot of innovation over the, kind of 2000s. And ultimately, most of that capital didn't return on investment. Most of that capital was lost. So roughly 25 billion was invested in clean tech, a number of reasons why it didn't work out. First, a lot of those companies used a ton of capital. They were very, very capital intensive businesses. They involved project building and financing and hardware. The R&D cycles were long, almost 10 years from the start to an actual attempt to IPO. As a result of that heavy capital expenditure, and because a lot of the R&D was early, most of those companies relied on a combination of government grants and loans. They weren't able to build business models that were profitable from the start or could see a clear path. That made it very hard for them to become self-sustaining. In addition, there was a huge cost premium. These weren't businesses, and these businesses weren't in a place where they could offer energy attractively. The pricing on energy coming from renewables was still 2x naturals and fossil and natural gas in particular, and that made it really hard to compete. So the silicon input prices for panels, for solar in particular, couldn't compete with cheap natural gas. And that made it really hard to get consumers and businesses to adopt. And because of the newness of this technology, most VCs didn't know what they were investing in at a technology level. They ended up spending more than they intended. Cycles took too long. Companies didn't have profitability. Most of those companies went under. Well, that meant a lot of people were disappointed and stepped away from the space. So for a number of years, cleantech was dead. In the 2010s, kind of the mid-2010s, a new era of innovators and investors started to emerge in what's now called climate tech. That's what the kind of the current buzzword is. But really, it's a decade of innovation that's been building on the learnings from clean tech. A few things were learned from the mistakes and the failings of clean tech. So really, just to kind of close out the last part of the conversation, what's happened is that more and more climate tech stocks are emerging, and these stocks are actually outperforming traditional tech. And that's making it a lot more interesting for investors and entrepreneurs. But the question is why? Well, a few things happened underlying this transition. First, individuals, consumers. In the last decade, consumers have started caring more. And that means that they're making decisions about what to buy and where to spend their money using environmental factors and ESG factors as part of their decision making. So that is shifting where the dollars and the rupees and the yen flow, because consumers are actually incorporating environmental impact into their purchasing decisions. As a result, there is more and more interest in businesses and in government in adopting standards that can support ESG, environmental sustainable goals. So in the US, for example, nearly, at this point, over half, almost 2/3 of the US states have passed mandatory energy efficiency standards, meaning that vehicles, buildings, and other assets now have to meet certain energy efficient benchmarks. That's an example of how regulation is combining with consumer preferences to create more supportive environments. Because of the consumer shifts and because of the regulatory pressures, there's more and more public market pressure on companies to do things around net zero. So 1 in 5 companies have committed to a net zero target. $50+ trillion is now formally committed to investing in ESG mandates. And the vast majority of ESG funds that emerge are still around. That means it's not a fringe. It's not just a quick, short-term trend. These are funds that are actually going to persist. And that means that this is considered an actual lasting trend. Because of these underlying shifts in consumer preferences, regulatory preferences, and requirements and public markets, there's more and more opportunity for innovation. New technologies have also emerged. So the combination of machine learning and AI, Internet of Things and connectivity, and blockchain infrastructure means that climate tech companies don't just have to build solar and wind farms. They can actually use a whole range of technologies. For example, forecasting climate risk, or using connectivity to make buildings smarter and more efficient, or using blockchain to track and trade carbon credits. Those are examples of using new technology in the climate innovation space. To use 5 examples, power, ag, electrification, carbon capture, and hydrogen, just these 5 areas of innovation are almost half of all the emissions created globally. And so there's just a huge amount of technology opportunity. But the question is, how are we going to move these forward? Well, one example is virtual power plants. These are businesses and climate tech companies that are actually turning dumb assets into power plants by turning them up and down and on and off. Therm is an example. We actually turn air conditioning and fridges into virtual power plants by dynamically controlling them and then connecting the extra power that we save to the utility need. A second example of climate tech in action is negative emissions. So actually being able to pull carbon and other gases out of the atmosphere. Climeworks is a good example. These are technologies that can actually capture and reduce carbon in the atmosphere. There's a huge amount of investor interest. So there's a lot of gaps in the climate ecosystem. Roughly a third of the technologies that we need to get to net zero don't exist today. That means that we're going to need almost $10 trillion of capital to be invested in the next 25 years. That's a huge amount of capital. That's roughly 10 times the capital being deployed today. And it's going to require a lot of concerted effort to get the kind of gigaton emissions needed. In the US alone, we're going to need to get 6.6 gigatons of emission reduction to get to net zero in the next 25 years. That's a huge number. People have been asking me, well, what's going on with climate capital? The world is resetting, investment and VC funding is down. Certainly, there's been a slowdown. But the reality is that climate capital is very resilient. Yes, there was a reduction in funding at the end of 22 and early 23 from the peak in 21. And of course, pricing has come down, and as a result, round sizes have come down as well. But the reality is there's more investors and more capital than ever. We have over 2,000 climate tech investors that have joined new deals since 2022. And most of those are lasting investors. They have funds that have been raised and are sitting there. So over 100 or at this point, over $100 billion of private climate capital is available across 130 plus firms, VCs and corporate VCs, as well as private equity firms. That's a lot of capital, $100 billion of available private capital. That's significant dry powder waiting to be invested. So even though there has been a general slowdown in the last 12 to 15 months in terms of valuation and capital formation, I would argue, and I would encourage you all to think about climate as a more resilient and more attractive category, and one that's going to see lots of capital deployed over the next several years. Well, you'll see this both in the form of new funds being announced and also funds deploying that capital. This is just a quick overview of many of the funds that were announced in the 21-22 period. The point is there are over 130 firms that are looking to deploy $100 billion of capital in this space. So what's next? I would argue it's you. It's all of you who are listening and thinking about building the future and are doing it. Change makers around the world. This is the time to innovate. This is the time to start or join a climate innovator or a climate innovation ecosystem, whether it's an early stage company, a growth company, or a policy group. There's a lot of capital, a lot of interest. The world needs this kind of solution set, and the time has never been better. Thanks for listening. Please reach out with questions. I appreciate your interest.
So kind of software and IoT sensor solutions that you do at Therma, right? So does that mean they can be used to they can be retrofitted onto the existing cooling solutions, which means essentially you are developing things that can turn the traditional dumb cooling solutions into smart cooling solutions. Would that understanding be correct?
That's exactly right. So basically we can turn an existing fridge, freezer, air conditioner into an intelligent load with smart sensors and smart controls on top of it. That's exactly right.
Oh, that's amazing. And you work with like hospitality, restaurants, and what are the other sectors that Therma focuses on?
Yeah, so today most of our business and most of our customers are in the food supply chain. So retail, hospitality, convenience store, grocery. We've just started working in healthcare this year with some labs, a hospital group, and a health system, and some pharmacies, but it's early. So most of our customers are in food. We're starting to move into pharma.
Okay. And what are the geographies that you're working on? How would you think, since you are from India, you are aware of the climate over here, and so how do you think these kind of environment-friendly solutions would work here? Like, let's say if we are talking about New Delhi, the summers here are brutal, right?
Totally. The tech can apply anywhere, ultimately. That's, I think, what's exciting is this is not US-specific technology. The need for grid flexibility is happening all over the world. Argentina is running out of power. Japan is running out of electricity. Korea is claiming they're going to have shortages. India is dealing with, record shortfalls. It's happening. Canada's got demand response programs running. We're just trying to get started. We're a small team, 70 people. We have customers in a few countries outside the US. I would love the tech to be scaled globally over time as we grow. I think there's a need in places like Delhi. My grandparents are from and live in Delhi. I go back every year. So absolutely, we could deploy this in places around the world, including Delhi. And we just need to find the right partners to do it.
Fantastic.